Today, we're putting a Sony Mirrorless camera on the cutting board and talking about the 4 settings that you need to change to help improve your photographic experience. Hello and welcome to episode number 89 of Photo Kitchen. I am your humble host, MD Welch, and today we are talking Sony mirrorless cameras and the 4 things that you need to know to help improve your photographic experience. Now, I do want to apologize to all my Canon, Nikon, Olympus, Pentax, and Fuji shooters that this is a very specific Sony video, and I also do want to say this is kind of a video more directed to those who are just getting into the Sony mirrorless system. Maybe you just purchased a new Sony camera and you want to get up to speed with the menu settings. This video is for those particular shooters. I'm not getting into super advanced settings or anything like that, although I have done other videos on more advanced focusing features, dynamic range, talking about zebras and so forth. And I will include a link to those videos in the description for this video. So let's get right into it and talk about our first thing that you need to know. Here's tip number 1.
One wonderful one!
First thing I want to point out is that the Sony menu system has gotten a lot of negative feedback over the years. Every camera system has improved. Unfortunately, just about every camera system has made pretty significant changes on where they put things, so you will have to double check your manual on where some of these settings are. The first one though should be pretty easy to find. I'm going to go to the first camera page icon here, and I'm going to come in and go to page number 1. Oops, we'll go backwards. There we go, page number 1. And I'm going to first talk about the raw JPEG file format setting here. Now, there is a phone book amount of videos on there about why RAW or why JPEG, why you should shoot one over the other. I'm not going to go down that particular path. I shoot RAW only. I don't shoot RAW or JPEG. And again, not really worth our time to go into. But the setting that I actually want to direct you to is if you do shoot RAW on a Sony camera, that you want to follow up with a second setting that is called RAW file type. And I currently have it set to uncompressed, and that is what I recommend. If you set the RAW file type to compressed, you are actually shooting a 12-bit RAW file. It's a little bit more compressed as well. There's no loss of quality, but you are shooting a lower bit depth from 12-bit to 14-bit. And you're talking about thousands of levels of tonal values that you're not capturing at 14 if you're shooting at 12. So my first recommendation, my first tip is if you are going to shoot RAW or RAW and JPEG, is make sure that you're shooting in the uncompressed mode so you get the full range of what the sensor is capable of doing. If you're a landscape shooter, if you're shooting a lot of different colors, these types of files really benefit from 14-bit. Also, if you're worried that maybe your exposure is off, 14-bit will give you a little bit more latitude in editing over 12-bit. Yes, it's going to take up more space on the cards. Yes, it might take a little bit longer to write to the memory cards or maybe write over to your computer when you're importing, say, to Lightroom Classic or over to Capture One. But the small price that you pay there is paid off in dividends later on with the ability to get higher quality prints, larger tonal values, reduced banding. I'm talking about those beautiful sunrises and sunsets for those landscape shooters out there. So I highly recommend making sure that you're not shooting in compressed, but uncompressed for your RAW workflow when working with a Sony mirrorless camera.
Yes, it's two, haha!
For step number 2, we're going back into our menu and we're going to go to a feature called Live View Displayed, which unfortunately is not in the camera settings, but in the movie settings. I highly recommend looking for this on your particular menu. It is found in just about every Sony mirrorless camera that I've ever used, starting all the way back with the first version of the A7S. Now, in this case, on my A7R Mark IV, you will find it under the menu tab or the second menu tab for movie, and then it is on page number 8 and it's called Live View Display. Now, this is one of those features that I highly recommend assigning a button to because it is something you're going to go back and forth, and it is buried in the menu, and if you don't use it a lot, you'll forget exactly where it's located. Now, on my camera here, and by the way, I got a little HDMI cable coming out of here for recording, I have this actually assigned assigned to a menu button on the back of my camera, and in this case, it is custom menu button number 3. Now, when I toggle this, if I go back over to my other camera here, when I toggle this, you'll see that when I go on and off, there's a bit of an exposure change, and there's also a bit of a white balance change. With live effect setting off, essentially the camera throws itself into what it would do if it was in all automatic mode, or the word auto on your menu dial. So this kind of just opens up your aperture all the way, does a reasonable shutter speed, cranks up the ISO, and also usually will throw your camera into auto white balance mode. So that's why we're seeing a little bit of a shift here in exposure and also in white balance. This is a great feature when you're working in low light situations. It's fantastic when you're working with strobes and maybe you've cranked up your shutter speed a lot to reduce the ambient and you're looking at a very, very dark scene. You could just simply turn this setting off and you will see everything that the camera is capable of seeing. So I've assigned this to a customized button on my camera. And if you're curious about customizing your camera, I have done another video of that, and I will include that link in the description.
Number 3!
For our third setting, we're going back to the menu button yet again, and we're gonna come into the first camera tab, so camera tab number 1, or the red tab, and this is on page 12. And again, this is probably gonna be different from one Sony model to the next Sony model, so you might have to go through the different pages. But on my A7R Mark IV, it is on page 12 of the camera tab, or tab number 1. And what we're talking about here is picture profiles, which I currently have this camera set into picture profile number 3, or PP3. Now, picture profile is a very Sony specific concept. This was actually introduced with its video camera system, and because Sony wants to integrate their mirrorless cameras with their video cameras, this is a way to kind of match up color spaces quickly and easily with those systems. Now, why is this something that you would do as a basic camera user? Well, the problem with picture profiles is, while they're great for video, and I'm recording video right now, so I'm using picture profile 3 on not only my mirrorless camera, but also on my FS700 that's recording the back of the other camera here. They're both set to picture profile number 3, and that kind of matches up the color space. But the problem with picture profiles when you're shooting still photos is that that picture profile is actually bonded or processed into the raw file format. Now, if I turn this off, if I go from PP3 to off, and I come into here, I have some other features that are now available because they are turned off with picture profiles. So that's another reason maybe you want to not use picture profiles. But picture profiles are different than creative styles. Now, if you've worked in Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, Capture One, you've probably run across the profile setting for your images in those programs. And this is what creative style is referring to. You could come into here and do vivid or standard, and this will just kind of give you a different starting point for your color space, your saturation, your contrast. And in those software programs, you could effectively change that after the fact. It is not permanently processed in the raw file. However, picture profiles most certainly are. And if you don't like something about the picture profile, say in this case PP3, what will happen is you will have to then edit around that. There's no place, at least in those 3 programs, where you can turn this off or essentially go back to picture profile being set to none. So unless you're doing a lot of video work, I advise you to turn picture profile to off. And if you are doing a lot of video work, I do recommend setting your picture profile to your camera to match up other cameras. So if you're doing multiple camera work, make sure they're all on the same picture profile, but you will have to remember to turn those off later on. Another little tip that I want to share is, again, in the customized video that I mentioned before, I talk about assigning things to shortcut menus or function menus. And I have my picture profile in that so I can quickly access this and turn this on or off in either video or still photography mode.
But I'm not done yet.
Before we get to our 4th tip or setting, I want to share with you a little bit of a bonus setting, and that is a feature that's found on newer Sony mirrorless cameras. Right around the introduction of the A6500, the Sony A7R Mark III, the A7, I think Mark III had this as well, and that is the ability to link your single focus point to your spot metering. Now, this is a bonus tip because it's not maybe something that everybody's going to use, but it is something that very few people know about, and Sony doesn't talk about nearly as much. Now, to access this, first thing that you need to do And actually, you don't have to do this in this order, but I am going to change my focus area to single point, or what they call flexible spot, in the Sony system. And I get this red box here, and I'll just move this over a little bit off to the side so it's a little bit easier to see on the background. Then I'm going to come into my menu setting, I'm going to go to my camera tab again, and I am going to go to exposure. Now in my case, again, on this particular camera, this is an exposure number 1 in the camera tab, or the red tab, and I'm going to come down to where it says spot metering point. Now, right now it's set to where you would like to set it to, and that is focus point link, meaning that the spot metering will be linked to your single autofocus point. Now, I'm going to go ahead and accept this, and then I'm going to come back into my camera menu setting here, and the last piece to this particular puzzle is to change my metering. And I'm just going to come into my meter over here. In this case, I've customized it, moved it around a little bit. I'm going to take my metering mode from a center weight to a spot metering, and I'm going to stay with standard here. And if you notice now, there's a little circle inside the box, and that is now the spot metering. And no matter where I move the focus point, that spot metering will follow. So if you were doing difficult exposure settings, you could go into spot metering and also a single or flexible spot point, and then be able to either get a meter reading or have the camera automatically set the meter where it needs to and get far more accurate exposures in difficult lighting situations. This again is a very particular setting, but it is one that I find that people first getting into camera systems, once they find it, they absolutely love it, when of course they need it.
Is for
So for our fourth and last tip or setting of the day, we are talking facial recognition on Sony mirrorless cameras. I'm going to hit the menu button, and in this particular instance on this camera, this is located again in the camera tab in AF2, which is actually page 6 of your menu here, called Face/Eye AF Set, which is definitely a mouthful. But this is where you're going to make changes to your face or eye recognition on your Sony mirrorless camera. And this is probably the one piece of technology in this video that is the most radically different depending on the make and model of your camera. Newer Sony cameras just have more facial or eye features. Also, the accuracy could be a little bit better as well. Now, this again is an A7R Mark IV, so you might find this to be common on the A7 Mark III, the A9 Mark II, the A1 will probably have about the same features, maybe a few more, especially on the A1. Now, when I click on this or come into this setting here, I find that I have a few different settings. First of all, there is a simple on-off here, face, eye priority, and autofocus. So if the camera's in autofocus, do you want it to detect a face or an eye? And I will talk a little bit more about how that works when we get out of this menu, because it is dependent on what focus points that you're using. The big one here though is subject detection. This was a recent kind of invention in the last couple of years with Sony, where it could detect between human or animal. Newer cameras, I believe the Sony A1 has the feature also now for birds, which is very nice. Now, this is important because if you are going between portraiture and animal or wildlife photography, your autofocus will be radically impact on whether or not you have the subject detection set in the right area. Again, this is actually a great thing to assign to a customized button. On my camera, I actually have it set to the bottom part of my wheel that I press down, and I could quickly go between human or animal on both of my Sony cameras, which does make for far more accurate autofocus and a much better experience. You can choose right or left eye select. I have this currently set to auto, but if you're always having people maybe go in a particular direction for your posing, you could also change that. You could have the face and eye frame display, so you just see a box around the human face, and the same is true with the eye. I recommend having both of these on simply because you will see whether or not the camera has detected the eye, and it will put just a little small box around the eye. The key to making this work is not only turning it on, but also trusting the camera a little bit. And this is very weird because we live in a day and age, and I will hit menu to get out of this and come back into, and I'll go into my quick menu or my function where I have my autofocus set up here. We're a little bit hesitant on letting cameras make a lot of decisions. This is why people will do manual mode, manual exposure, manual focus, have single autofocus points. But if you're working with eye detection and you're trying to really have the camera leverage this technology, you might find that instead of doing a very small focus area, that it's far more beneficial to go either into a wide or a zone area. This way it will detect the eyes and be able to quickly find your subject. If you do work in a system where you're working with, say, flexible spot, to make this system work well, you're going to have to move the spot over the area of the eye. Now, one thing I will say is if you're working with multiple subjects and you're trying to differentiate between focusing on one subject or another, the smaller area is great because you could kind of put it over the face of the subject and then it will just find the eye in that area of the box. So there is a little bit of going back and forth between your focus modes and also your eye detection. Well, that concludes our 4 tips or settings that you need to know for Sony mirrorless cameras. Please like this video, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. I would also love to read any feedback that you might have about this video, any comments that you might have, how long you've been using the Sony mirrorless system, of course, were these tips helpful, and also, was there a tip or something that you wish you would have known about at the beginning of your Sony experience that would have helped you out early on? Until next time, this is MD Welch wishing you all the best from the Photo Kitchen.